And a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia. The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries who have condemned Russia's war in the United Nations General Assembly.
So the world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia supported by China or any other country to freeze the war on its own terms. This is the statement of the Secretary of State of the United States, who believes that the war should not be frozen right now because there are certain conditions imposed or terms imposed by Russia and China. But let's be objective. History is always written by the victors, as well as negotiations and settlements and especially surrender and capitulation deals during wars and the aftermath is also imposed by the victors. On the 8th of May 1945, Nazi Germany signed a legal document declaring the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich to the Allied forces, which ended World War II in Europe. I'm not saying that the conditions are the same in Ukraine, but if you're objective, if you're neutral, and if you're honest, you realize that Ukraine and NATO are not the winning side now in this proxy war in Ukraine. Therefore, the reaction from the United States and the UK is a combination of refusal for the status quo and attempts to change the status quo. There is a certain military status quo that is prevailing in Ukraine, and that is that Russia already occupied the largest swath of territories, mostly in the Donbas region, in Mariupol, and also they have full control over the peninsula and on the Black Sea. Therefore, this status quo is not in the interest of the United States, the UK, the NATO countries, and they refuse the current status quo and they want to change it. I mean, if we see it from the perspective of NATO, maybe they have the right to refuse the status quo because they don't want to be the losing side, right? But how are they planning to change the status quo? One of the steps taken from the NATO side to change the status quo is by supplying Ukraine with depleted uranium. And this is very serious information that has popped out yesterday on the 21st of March, which says the UK will send armor-piercing rounds which contain depleted uranium to Ukraine for use with the tank squadron donated by the British Army. Defense Minister Baroness Goldie made the admission yesterday in response to a written parliamentary question from crossbench peer Lord Hilton. Goldie said, quote, "Such rounds are highly effective in defeating modern tanks and armored vehicles," quote ended. Depleted uranium rounds have been linked to cancer and birth defects. They were fired extensively by Allied forces in Iraq. The rounds are radioactive, and scientists believe their toxic effects on human health can continue to be felt long after conflicts have ended. A White House spokesperson refused to confirm whether the US was supplying such rounds to Ukraine when asked by a reporter in January. Britain is sending 14 Challenger 2 main battle tanks to Ukraine. Now, I would love to show you some photos from Iraq on the aftermath of the Allied forces using depleted uranium in Iraq and the birth defects that occurred in Iraq up until this moment. I also would like to show you photos from Vietnam when the US military used chemical agents, the Agent Orange, and they showered entire forests where the rebels were hiding with these chemical materials. And I would like to show you the birth defects from there, but because of the YouTube community standard guidelines, this YouTube channel will be probably deplatformed, demonetized, and probably canceled. So if you want to know about this case, I encourage you to go to Google and just search birth defects, depleted uranium, Iraq, or birth defects in Vietnam, and see how horrendous the aftermath of using such a weapon would be or was in Iraq, Vietnam, and elsewhere. They also used it in Syria, in Raqqa, and how the situation on the health wise would be in Ukraine. And please remember, let's suppose this depleted uranium may change the balance of power in favor of Ukraine, right? Which is something I rule out that possibility. 14 British tanks are not going to change the status quo. They're trying as much as they can to keep the hostilities going. But let's suppose this depleted uranium changes now the status quo in Ukraine, and Ukraine wins this war. Whose sons and daughters will be born with will have some birth defects? Aren't they gonna be Ukrainians? Because see, this repercussions on the health of the people is gonna be for decades. It's not gonna be just for a month or two, a week or two. It's gonna be a long-term effect on the environment, on agriculture, and on humans' health. Now, as I already mentioned, the American officials refuse to comment on the uranium reports, and they refuse to say if they are sending depleted uranium to Ukraine from the American side, and they refuse to comment on this issue that the report that says the UK is sending depleted uranium to Ukraine. However, current and former American officials were very quick in expressing concern in the past days about the Russian-Chinese pact. There are so many officials on TV nowadays talking about the Chinese and Russian pact, and they were raising concern and talking about it from the perspective that we are losing our momentum, we are losing our grip over the world, and they are condemning this. I will start this with Nikki Haley. She is the former US ambassador to the UN. So Nikki Haley says, a win for Russia is a win for China. This is not a territorial dispute. This is a fight for freedom, and it is a fight we have to win. Let's take a look.
How do you see it, China's role in Russia and what they're doing now?
This goes back to the debate that, we have to talk about this in a way that we understand that there is nothing China would love more than to see Russia win this war on Ukraine, because a win for Russia is a win for China. These are two countries that have named and two dictators that have said they are unlimited partners. We need to remember that. They chose those words carefully. You look at the images today. That was very intentional. This is the new axis of evil, with Iran being their junior partner. What we have to do is stay focused. We have to have the backs of Ukraine. That doesn't mean we have money or troops, but we have to finish this because China does not want that. And what we have to make sure of is when Ukraine wins this war against Russia, that will send a message with China that wants to take Taiwan. It'll send a message to North Korea. It'll send a message to Iran. We have to finish this. This is not a territorial dispute. This is a fight for freedom, and it's one that we have to win.
Look, I agree with her that if Russia wins in Ukraine, which will eventually will happen, it is a win for China. And I would be very naive to believe that this hasn't been on the table of discussion in Moscow recently. I mean, if Putin and when Putin and Xi met in Moscow, and yesterday it was the last day of this state visit, it would be naive to think that they haven't discussed this. If China is backing Russia financially during this proxy war in Ukraine against NATO, then of course Russia will support China during the reunification with Taiwan. And this is something I would be not honest if I say that they haven't discussed this, for sure. And if Ukraine loses this war, it will definitely mean also a lose for NATO. and it will mean that Russia and China will have way more status, bigger status in this international community, and they will also impose their will in certain parts of the world. This is out of question. But telling me that this is about freedom, dictatorships, and all these cliches, I mean, in Arabic we say khalas. It's like if you say this in 2001, in 2003, this is the same talking points for 2 or 3 decades now. I mean, in the Afghanistan war, in the Iraqi war, maybe some Americans bought to this BS, but now it's nobody believes that the United States represents a force for freedom, a force for democracy. No one, because the experience proves. In Afghanistan, how is the democracy and freedom working after 2 decades of occupation? How are the freedoms and democracy is working in Iraq after 2 decades of occupation? How are freedoms and democracy working in Libya after bombing and destroying the country? How are freedoms and democracy working in Syria after waging a regime change war and supporting the democratic rebels there? Everybody knows now that this is an utter BS and nobody believes in this, right? So saying that this is about values, this is about democracy, nobody buys into this crap, in my opinion. But before I continue with the American officials, former and current, what was the Russian response to the reports that the UK will send depleted uranium to Ukraine? And in this regard, President Putin, he made a comment in which he says, the UK announced not only the supply of tanks to Ukraine, but also depleted uranium shells. I would like to note that if all this happens, Russia will have to react accordingly.
Мы не обошли вниманием ситуацию вокруг Украины. Полагаем, что многие из положений, выдвинутого Китаем мирного плана, созвучны российским подходам и могут быть взяты за основу для мирного урегулирования, когда к нему будут готовы на Западе и в Киеве. Однако такой подход, пока такой готовности с их стороны мы не наблюдаем. Но более того, вот только что мне сообщили, в то время, когда мы с председателем обсуждали вопрос возможности реализации китайского плана мирного урегулирования, а председатель КНР уделил большое внимание своим мирным инициативам в ходе нашей вчерашней беседы с глазу на глаз, вот сегодня стало известно, что Великобритания устами заместителя главы Министерства обороны этой страны объявила не только о поставках танков на Украину, но и снарядов с объединенным ураном. Похоже, что Запад действительно решил воевать с Россией до последнего украинца уже не на словах, а на деле. Но хотел бы в этой связи отметить, что если все это будет происходить, то соответствующим образом Россия вынуждена будет реагировать, имея в виду, что коллективный Запад начинает применять уже оружие с ядерным компонентом.
So, guys, this war in Ukraine, there were so many steps taken, let's be honest, from both sides. Escalatory steps, it's like a tit for a tat. Every time you see, for example, if Russia escalated in the type of arms they're using, the other side supplies more to Ukraine, different types of weaponry. Or if the other side supplies a different type of weaponry to Ukraine, such as the depleted uranium, the Russian side will also escalate its use of weaponry. So we're not only talking about what type of warfare is this. Is it a proxy? Is it a direct? And also, no, it's also about the type of weapons being used during these hostilities. So if the British side, which they confessed they will, or they have already done, sending a depleted uranium to Ukraine, what do you think the Russian response would be? I'm not a military expert. Let me know in the comments below. What do you think? What would be the response of Russia in this regard? Are they also going to use a depleted uranium, or they're going to use a different type of weaponry? What type of weaponry do you think Russia will use if this type of weaponry is used in Ukraine by the Ukrainian side. Up until this moment, it hasn't been used yet, but if Ukraine uses it, what's going to be the reaction of the Russian side? Let me know your opinion in the comments below, guys. The second video that I wanted to show you is for John Kirby. He's of course, the spokesperson for the National Security Council in the White House. And in this video, he says China and Russia that are growing closer together see useful purposes for chaffing and bustling at, quote, rules-based order, the joke of the the joke. Like, if there is any joke that could come a top tier there, it's this rules-based order. Yeah, okay. So China and Russia are chaffing and bustling at rules-based order. They want to change the rules of the game. In fact, they want to see the rest of the world play by their rules. Let's take a look what he says.
I don't think we're overly exercised about that comment. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, MJ, where they were talking about a relationship without limits, right? Partnership without limits. So we're not going to get all hot and bothered about the use of friends. What we've seen is these are two countries that are growing closer together, that see in each other useful purposes for pushing back, as I said yesterday, for chafing and bristling at a rules-based order around the world. They want to change the rules of that game. In fact, they would love nothing better, both countries, to see the rest of the world play by their rules rather than the ones that are enshrined in the UN Charter and what everybody else is following.
I mean, to be honest with you, Russia and China are definitely trying to change the rules of the game, but they're not trying to change the rules-based order. And I'm being very objective with you, because there is no rules-based order to change from the first place. At the first place. What do you mean by rules-based order? Do you mean that the United States, which has leading the international community at least since the fall of the Soviet Union, for 3 decades, they were following a certain rules-based order, and there was an equality among all countries, and all countries were treated evenly, and international law prevailed and respected. I mean, I can count now countless number of violations of international law by the police, which is the United States, that claims it is leading this rules-based order, right? How many violations do you want me to count? And how many times the ICC issued an arrest warrant against any American official? Like 0. So there is no rules-based order. There is a jungle, and the head of the jungle is the United States and some of its allies. And they are managing these international affairs in a way that fits their geopolitical interests and financial interests. And when it comes to geopolitical interests, I would say, yes, it is about national security of the United States as a superpower. But when it comes to the financial benefits, it's not about a welfare, let's say, a social welfare in the United States, because there is no social welfare in the United States. And the pay and the salaries are really ridiculous in the United States. There is no healthcare, and college fees are ridiculously high. There is no welfare in the United States. If the US used all these wars around the world that they waged, whether directly or indirectly, in favor of their people, and they provided certain level of welfare for their people, I would say respect. At least they are serving their own people. But they're not even serving their own people. They're serving a very tiny little elite. They represent lobbyists, they represent manufacturers, especially in the military industrial complex. They represent these social media companies, pharmaceutical industries. There's so many strong non-state actors in the United States who play an essential part, an instrumental role in influencing the foreign policy of the United States or benefiting from the foreign policy of the United States. So I'm not going to come and tell you that this empire is serving its own people. It is not. Now, in the same regard, John Kirby also brags about or says China doesn't represent. So He says China not impartial in any way on Ukraine crisis. And I mean, look, let's first watch it.
You can reasonably look at China as impartial in any way. They haven't condemned this this invasion. They haven't stopped buying Russian oil and Russian energy. President Xi saw fit to fly all the way to Moscow, hasn't talked once to President Zelensky, hasn't visited Ukraine, hasn't bothered to avail himself of the Ukrainian objective, and he and his regime keeps parroting the Russian propaganda that this is somehow a war of the West on Russia, that it's some sort of existential threat to Mr. Putin. That's just a bunch of malarkey. Ukraine posed no threat to anybody, let alone Russia.
Look, there are two things here. One, China, maybe not the most impartial mediator in this regard, but it is the most serious mediator in this regard. And it has proven that it can bring conflicting sides together, such as Saudi Arabia and China, regardless of its own interests or positions on Iran and Saudi Arabia. And we have to know the relations between China and, for example, Iran is of higher stance compared to the relations between China and Saudi Arabia. And despite that, China brought these two parties together. And the same way now in Ukraine. Of course, the relations between China and Russia are like a very important level. We can now maybe argue that it has become strategic relations between them. But China hasn't provided Russia with any weaponry, for example, to fight against the Ukrainian soldiers or Ukrainian forces or whatever battalions they have there. On the other hand, the United States provided all sorts of weaponry to Ukraine. The UK did, France did, Germany did. So they're also not partial or a neutral mediator in this regard. So at the end, who's going to mediate? Somebody has to mediate, right? And the mediation always happens from a strong country, a country that can guarantee the implementation of the agreement, the security interests of Russia, and the security interests of Ukraine. And I don't see any other power out there that can play this role than China itself. So if you refuse China as a neutral or impartial mediator, then you have to name one. And who is that one? The United States or the UK, who is sending now depleted uranium to Ukraine? I mean, that's crazy to think that way, right? So the second thing that John Kirby keeps speaking about is rules-based order, that they're changing the rules-based order and the Chinese regime. I mean, what kind of rhetoric is that? They keep repeating this non-diplomatic language towards Russia and China, calling them regimes, which means illegitimate governments. So what do you expect from China to do? To stay aside and wait for NATO to finish its job with Russia and then be completely ready and completely free to come after China? I mean, the problem is, from my side at least, is that they're treating us as sheeple. They're treating us as someone who cannot read geopolitics. They're treating us as someone like we're brainless people and do not understand anything. Maybe this is directed to certain people. But when you are a spokesperson of the National Security Council at the White House and you are talking to journalists and experts, to audience who at least can connect the dots, and you say, China is interpreting this anyways, this conflict as if somehow a NATO conspiracy against Ukraine. Of course it is. Of course this is a proxy war from NATO against Russia. Of course, the expansion of NATO to the east of Berlin after the fall of the Berlin Wall is about encircling Russia. Of course, the expansion to Georgia, to Ukraine, to the other Poland is about encircling Russia, cutting all sorts of relations between Russia and Europe, and isolating Russia in a way that they would not have any sort of energy links with Europe because strong relations, economic relations, like energy coming from Russia and manpower and technology from, especially from Germany, it would create a very strong Eurasia that the United States cannot have a control of, right? So this is the goal. I mean, don't treat me like a sheep, bro. We know what you're doing, and we know that if you defeat Russia, you will come after China, and the Chinese aren't stupid. If you think they're stupid. The other video that I wanted to show you is for John Bolton. And I remember John Bolton from like when I was a kid, 2002, 2003. I think back then he was the UN, the United States ambassador to the UN. And then he became the national security advisor to Trump. And he also has something to say about the Chinese and Russian pact. Let's take a look together.
И аналитики в течение прошлого года говорили, что Китай стесняется России и пытается сепарировать себя от связи с ней. Но это неправда. Они усиливали экономические связи, оказывали поддержку, покупая российскую нефть и газ, проводили российские финансовые операции через китайскую систему. И Китай, и Россия говорят, что это союз без границ. И я думаю, что они говорят это серьезно. В этом настоящая проблема для Запада, независимо от того, что произойдет на Украине. Я думаю, что образуется ось Россия-Китай, к которой примыкают Иран и Северная Корея. Взгляните на карту, взгляните на географию. Нам необходимо относиться к этому серьезно.
I mean, look, he is partially true. This Russian-Chinese alliance represents a serious threat to the American hegemony over the world. And how are they planning to deal with this? This is the real question. Are the Americans going to accept that there is a big power emerging and there is no way for them to push this power away, and this power will be part of the multipolar world, or they're going to fight these two countries? And is there any serious person who thinks that the United States can fight against Russia and China? No. So they have now two options. Either accept Russia and China as partners in international community, and to give them the opportunity to present themselves as a mediator in some parts of the world or leaders in some parts of the world, so divide the regions of influence around the world, or you're going to go to war against them. And the second option is a nuclear annihilation. It's not gonna be a few million people dead. Believe me, it's gonna be the end of the humanity as we know it. If China and Russia come together, two of the biggest nuclear powers in the world, and against one of the two like UK and the US, who have also tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, it's gonna be the end of humanity. So yesterday I was talking with an expert who works for the Schiller Institute, and he says he doesn't believe that the United States will go to such type of warfare against China and Russia. At the end, they will be humbled, and they will be forced to be humbled and accept the realities and work on changing that in the future. So probably he is correct, and I hope he is correct on this. The last video that I want to show you here is from John Kirby again, and how many times he mentioned the term American leadership or US leadership during his yesterday's press conference, which gives you the impression that the US feels that they're losing their grip over the world. And that's why during a small press conference, he mentioned that so many times. Take a look.
U.S. leadership around the world, U.S. leadership around the world, America's increasing leadership around the world, U.S. leadership around the world, of American leadership, the power of American convening leadership, American leadership around the world.
So it's a little bit funny to see he's mentioning this so many times. But when Xi Jinping was the last meeting with Putin, and he was leaving to the airport, and Putin went with him to his car, Xi told Putin, change is coming that hasn't happened in 100 years, and we are driving this change together. Putin replied, I agree. Xi said, please take care, my friend Putin told him have a safe trip. This was an interesting, like a last discussion between the both sides. As I mentioned, when you two leaders call themselves friends, especially in the Eastern culture, Chinese and Russian, it means a lot. That means they trust each other in this first war against the American-led international so-called system. And at the same time, they trust each other in terms of changing that through their economic cooperation and intelligence cooperation, probably also military cooperation in the near future. So what are the agreements that they signed? What they signed is, I'm going to share with you again. So this is it. One, China is clearly Russia's top trade and economic partner. Trade and economic cooperation is a priority for our relationship. Two, Russia is prepared to increase its oil and liquefied natural gas supply to China. Russia is helping to build atomic stations in China. Four, the Ukraine-Russia peace plan was also discussed. Five, Putin says Russia and China strongly oppose violating interests of other countries to gain our own advantage. I think there was also discussion about dealing with yuan and the ruble in the trade cooperation and relationships between the both sides. And most probably they also discussed how to end the dollar hegemony over the global financial affairs. This is the main, I think, the powerhouse of the United States at the moment. It's the dollar domination over the global trade affairs, over the banking systems around the world. And we have to know that the United States can print as much as dollar they want, but any other country cannot print as much dollars they want. So the United States can always pump and print new dollars and pretend that they have a strong economy. And but at the same time, other countries cannot buy or cannot print as much as dollars possible. So in my opinion, if this point is being discussed and they have a strategy to end the dollar hegemony over the global financial affairs and the banking systems, etc., this will be the last nail in the coffin of the American empire, because they are in a huge trillions of dollars of debt that they're not going to be able to even pay all around the world, because they're not paying it and they're just printing new money. And this is going to be a huge collapse. And we can see now the banking system in the United States. And if Biden comes and tells the people, don't panic, everything is fine, and your money is safe in our banks, that means it's not safe. Just take the opposite of that and take it from Kim.com, I would say. Who knows better in this on these issues than Joe Biden himself. The last thing I want to mention today, the Republicans and the conservatives in the United States are attempting to portray this Russian-Chinese pact as a partisan failure, and they're blaming the Democrats in this regard, and I believe this can't be further from the truth. For example, we have this Jack Posobiec. He's a very famous, notorious, I would say, conservative commentator and an activist. He says, while the Democrats distracting you, Putin and Xi solidified their alliance in a 4.5-hour Moscow meeting. Quote, they are putting together the new roadmap for the world order. Look, when you watch the video, he makes lots of sense, in my opinion, but blaming it on the Democrats, it makes no sense at all, and I will come for that later. But let's first watch it.
What are China and Russia doing right now? Putin and Xi are meeting in Moscow. They are putting together the new roadmap for the world order. Xi Jinping came out and said unequivocally, China stands with Russia to hold up the world order. What are they doing? They're going around the horn. Saudi and Iran, they just signed a deal. They just reestablished diplomatic relations. The Saudis and the Iranians, the Sunnis and the Shia, thousands of years of warfare and conflict, the sectarian violence. The United States spent, 20 years? It's been 20 years today. in the war in Iraq. Couldn't take care of this in Iraq. China does it in a day. Turkey and Syria, done. They're hammering it out. Erdogan, Assad, you guys go in your place. You're going to stay on this side of the room. You're going to stay on that side of the room. Mommy and daddy are here now. Do you understand what's going on? The United States is now being reduced to that island over on the other side of the world that causes trouble, that is sending rainbow flags and pink-haired weirdos everywhere. Hey, they buy our stuff, though, so at least we can keep we'll pick up the phone when they call from time to time, but you don't really have to listen to them. There was an Austrian diplomat once, Mesrick. You know what he said? In a world of three, be two. So while all of this is happening domestically in the United States, complete chaos, complete political opposition, warfare, politically. Here in the U.S., absolute chaos. They've just overturned the entire table. Apple cart everywhere. Do you really expect us to think that Xi Jinping and Putin, who just met, we're told, for 4.5 hours, aren't clinking glasses and laughing? They're laughing all the way to their bank, which is disconnected from our banks that are crumbling. Credit Suisse out of Zurich falls apart completely. The West is crumbling before their eyes. They've been driven together by the United States, by the deep state, by the globalist American empire. And they say, you know what? We're going to be rich. We're going to be rich. And all the rest of the world are going to be our little serfs. They're going to be our little servants. They're going to be our little mindless consumer zombies. And that's all they're going to do. Russia will be Russia. China will be China. They will be the big dogs. And the rest of you, you'll be watching Netflix. You'll be saying, hey, what's the next Avatar, James Cameron? Please, please, give me more Avatar. I need to see more of the blue, the Navi. Get the Navi, get my Navi soy jack right into my brain. Download the latest Navi. And then you're having kids and they're growing up. They just get sucked right into the screen. You put the screen right on their face. You slap it to them from the moment they're born. And they go out into the world. That's what they want for you. Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, all this. It's being designed. You may not believe in the fourth turning, but you better wake up because you're in one. You are in one right now.
I mean, look, he makes lots of sense. I'm sure, he's a Trump supporter. And he would think that if it was Trump, this would have not happened. And probably that's true. But the only difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is who are they going to fight first? Is it Russia first or China first? And this is quite obvious. If it was Trump, he would have now bulldogging against China and Iran through Taiwan and other fights in the Middle East. And when the Democrats come, they bulldog against Russia through the gate of Ukraine. This is just about the priorities and not about the strategy. Strategy is the same. Global domination. And when you have competitors to this domination, you have to knock them out. And the two biggest competitors are Russia and China. And you will do that. If you're an empire and if you want to keep your hegemonic status, you will do that. So let's be honest with that. But he's also correct that there's so much degeneracy that hit the United States, the society there. And I am very constant follower of lots of podcasts, lots of videos about all this gender ideology, identity politics. People are really losing their minds there. And the technology is helping the people to lose their minds. And the Russians and the Chinese are laughing at the Americans when They are fighting over if my pronouns is he or ze or them, or I don't know what the fuck else that they believe in. And they're teaching their children engineering, rocket science, military, economics. I mean, what do you expect? If you go to school and you have been indoctrinated by ideologies, what how can you use that ideology when it comes to building a state, building a society, building an infrastructure? So you're emptying your society from the construction force when you impose ideologies on the people that can benefit no one. And you can see lots of people are becoming very weak, especially men in Western societies and in the United States. There is a big war against masculinity, and masculinity has become some sort of a virus for them that we, as men, we have to be weak, and we have to abandon our competitiveness, and if we are competent, we have to abandon that. We shouldn't compete. We should not, we have to be slaves and accepting everything and subjugated by the system. This is what the also these few elites are trying to do. So they're also working against the interests of the American people, but also against their own geopolitical interests. And the last tweet that I want to show before I end up this video, again, similarly, as I mentioned, the conservatives are blaming the Democrats. So here is Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is a Canadian psychologist and probably also a philosopher. He says, "Oh, good, Russia and China together, another foreign policy coup for the delusional Democrats." And I typed him and said, "You are delusional to think this happened because of the Democrats alone. The US empire's policy in the past decades, aka the deep state, in oppressing the majority of the world's population made this happen. And that's not a bad news." And these people trying to make things partisan are really silly. Look, I would be very honest with you. Jordan Peterson speaks a lot of sense about masculinity, family values, etc., relationships. But when it comes to foreign policy, this guy is complete, I would say, probably unaware or very biased. And we have seen how he called for regime change in Iran as if it worked in Iraq or anywhere in the Middle East before. And now he's blaming the Democrats. This is just a stupid game that these conservatives and the liberals play against each other, and it's just a divide and conquer. And they are both sides playing this game, and they are just making their country weaker and weaker. This is, if you are in the West or in the United States, this is the time now to unite. And they're just trying to blame each other. And this is not about a Democrats' failure, or the Republicans' failure. This is a failure for the US empire for treating the rest of the world as if they are their subordinates. And they're treating them with complete disrespect, treating them with complete arrogance, treating them as like they're colonizers, right? They came as colonizers, and they impose their will on the rest of the world, and lots of people do not accept that. And especially when it comes to their natural resources, they are being robbed day and night in Africa. They're being Middle Eastern countries are being robbed day and night through these multinational corporations. And when a country refuses to accept these multinational corporations, then the United States comes and bombs this country to the ashes, and then the corporations come. And this is it. And when these people see there is an alternative, even if they don't like Russia and China, they will definitely choose the alternative, because the devil that they were treating with was too brutal for them, that they are shocked into extent that they would accept anything else. Like in Syria, despite the earthquake and everything that happened, the United States refuses to lift the sanctions up until this moment. They have frozen a few sanctions, which is cosmetic, for 6 months or something. As if the proxy war and the terroristic war was not enough, and now you have to deal with these sanctions. And I just want to say, like, the United States is not the police of the world. So they don't have any right to impose any sorts of sanctions on anyone around the world. Who are you to impose sanctions on Syrians or Iranians or Russians or Chinese or Cubans or Venezuelans? Like, who are you, really? This makes me really upset. Anyways, I've been your host, Georg Almasyan of Syriana Analysis. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it with your friends and hit the like button. And if you want to support my independent work on YouTube, please become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.